I remember one night when I was a kid, when my parents rented the movie Spirited Away. I watched the beginning of the movie up until the scene where Chihiro's parents turn into pigs before running away. I remember being horrified at the concept of losing your parents, much less watching them being turned into pigs. Years later, I was at a friend's house, and while we would watch anime together fairly regularly, one night he turned on Princess Mononoke. Similarly to my experience with Spirited Away, I was frightened by the opening scene. The battle with the demon boar was likely one of the most violent and bloody action pieces I'd seen up to that point. Yet, I remember I kept watching so I wouldn't seem like a scaredy cat in front of my friend. I didn't think much of these movies until I was a lot older, but they stayed with me. Eventually I saw bits and pieces of My Neighbor Totoro, Howl's Moving Castle, The Cat Returns, but none of those movies were as intense as the first two that I had seen. For the longest time, I'd understood Studio Ghibli to be the Disney of Japan. After all, Disney handled the distribution rights for pretty much all of Ghibli's catalog in the West. I'd known that their movies were some of the most well-known anime films in the West and worldwide, but I'd still only ever heard of their more popular movies, the ones I mentioned earlier. And I had thought Hayao Miyazaki was the sole filmmaker behind the studio, and okay, boy oh boy, was I wrong. I'd also thought the studio's name was pronounced Ghibli instead of Ghibli, and I would insist that other people were wrong when they pronounced it Ghibli, which is sort of embarrassing in hindsight. Studio Ghibli is a collaboration between several artists, initially being founded by Hayao Miyazaki and Isao Takahata, and Toshio Suzuki. With a history spanning nearly 4 decades and over 20 films, Studio Ghibli has more than earned its reputation considering the quality of their hits. But what about the movies that didn't break into the mainstream in Western culture? How many people out there anywhere can say that they've seen everything that Studio Ghibli has to offer? Me, I can say that. In this video, I've documented my experience watching every single Studio Ghibli feature film. So this is going to be the inaugural video in a sort of secondary series that I will have on my channel, essentially where I binge watch every movie within the catalog of a director, studio, franchise, whatever I really want it to be. Initially, I had conceived this project as being a study of Miyazaki specifically, as I foolishly believed Miyazaki was the only one behind Studio Ghibli. I was already a few movies in by the time I realized that that was not true. So I don't think any other entries in this series in the future will be quite as massive as this one. I actually had to cut it down quite significantly because it ended up being way bigger than I thought it was going to be, which is also why it took so long for me to get it done. But I spent 25 days watching 25 Studio Ghibli movies. And now I've watched every film not only directed by Miyazaki, but ever produced by the studio. At the beginning of this project, I had set out a couple of rules for myself. Number 1, I was going to stick to feature-length animated films only. So while Studio Ghibli has done a whole bunch of other things, including, like I said, music videos, one anime series, and like a couple of documentaries, I'm only watching the feature-length productions. And 2, I was going to stick to the dubs. Normally, I am a subs purist, but I'd heard that the dubs for Ghibli films were exceptional, so I decided I would give them a try. I do want to note that sometimes I can change certain things in the movies from the original artistic intention, as certain dubs do deviate slightly from the original intentions, but still, for the most part, I'd heard that the dubs were generally a really good experience, so why not go out of my comfort zone? I'd also included 3 movies that are technically not Studio Ghibli films. The first 2, Lupin III, The Castle of Cagliostro, and Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind actually predate the founding of Studio Ghibli, but like I said at the beginning, this was originally just going to be a video about Miyazaki, so eat my shorts. I'd also included The Red Turtle, and while some people say that it's not a real Ghibli movie, they collaborated it, they got it produced, so it's a Ghibli movie, leave me alone. Many people consider the 2 Studio Ponok films as well as Takahata's early movies to also be a part of their Ghibli retrospectives and things like that, but that would mean like 7 more movies worth of editing and writing, and this already took too long, so no. I organized my binge by watching the movies in chronological order from their release dates, starting from Miyazaki's directorial debut. This is the list of all of the movies I'm including in my great Studio Ghibli binge, so if you want to, you can pause the video and just take a look right now. After watching each movie, I recorded my gut reaction to the film, along with any initial thoughts I may have had after finishing the movie. So I'll be presenting those with a little bit of background on each film. I'll only be including a shortened version of those initial gut reactions. I'll upload a second video to this channel if anybody wants to see those. The link will be in the description. I've also given each movie a rating out of 10, and at the very end of the video, I'll give my full comprehensive ranking of which ones are my favorite to my least favorite. All of my rankings are not my opinion, they are objective facts, they are inarguable, they are true. So please tell me how much you agree with me and how good my taste is in the comments below. One more thing to note here, I won't be commenting on the quality of the animation or the soundtracks here for the most part. You can just assume that they're all amazing, because they are. So even if I'm criticizing a movie's story, they might have a higher ranking because of the sheer quality of the animation and everything behind it than I might otherwise give it. And I've done my best to avoid spoilers, so you should be able to go into this video without having to worry about that. But by the end of the video, you should still have a comprehensive idea of what every Studio Ghibli movie is and which ones you might like and what you might want to watch. Okay, without further ado, let's get binging. Wow. Movie 1, Lupin III, The Castle of Cagliostro. 1979 saw the release of Lupin III, The Castle of Cagliostro. Miyazaki had co-directed the first Lupin anime series in part with Takahata earlier in the decade, and was given a shot at directing his first film because of it. Here we see many of the hallmarks that would come to define his canon: an environmentalist message, a loose approach to adaptation, and whimsical aeronautic devices. The story of the movie is that of gentleman thief Arsène Lupin III's excursion to the fictional European country of Cagliostro in order to get to the bottom of a counterfeiting ring. There he meets Clarice, a princess who is betrothed to the dastardly Count Cagliostro, and adventure ensues. Here are my initial thoughts. Okay, so I just saw Miyazaki's directorial debut being Lupin III, The Castle of
Cagliostro.
I think my gut reaction is that, you know, it was good. It was a fun movie. I think it's not perfect by any means, and I think there's stuff that could be improved in it. It had me laughing. The action was gripping for the most part. I think the movie kind of gets a little weaker as it goes on. It's definitely worth watching, and it's by no means a bad movie. I would actually say it's pretty good. My final ranking on Lupin III, The Castle of Cagliostro is 7 out of 10. Movie number 2, Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind. Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind is an adaptation of a manga series Miyazaki penned of the same name. Many credit this film's success to being the catalyst for Studio Ghibli's founding, and while it only adapts a portion of the full story told in the manga, it is remembered fondly as Miyazaki's first project where he had full creative control. Nausicaa is the princess of a small kingdom in the Valley of the Wind, one of the last safe havens for humanity on a post-apocalyptic world that was destroyed by man's pollution. She braves the dangers of the vast, toxic jungle that covers most of the Earth's surface, returning with resources others would not be able to obtain due to her connection with nature and willingness to learn from it. However, the other scattered kingdoms have brought conflict to the Valley of the Wind, wrapping up Nausicaa in a much larger plot and kickstarting her adventure. I just watched Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind. This is the second film that Miyazaki has directed. I think I loved it. I think some of the other big bonuses for me are the like the creature design and the character design. As always, Miyazaki's killing it, and like some of the action set pieces with all of these airships are mind-blowing. The dialogue in this movie is super clunky. I don't know if it's just the dub, but everybody's constantly explaining everything to you as you go along. I don't need that. I think I still really love this movie. It's got its flaws and it stumbles in places, but you can really see the sort of distinct identity that Miyazaki is carving out for himself here. My final ranking on Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind is 8 out of 10. Movie number 3, Castle in the Sky. This movie is the first true Studio Ghibli production. Castle in the Sky is considered to be a progenitor of the steampunk genre, and was massively influential for its time in several anime series and games. As the studio's inaugural film, it feels like a thesis statement for everything that would follow. Once again, this is a heavily anti-war film with environmental themes. This is the story of a young girl, Shita, who, after being first kidnapped by shady government agents, and subsequently attacked by sky pirates, falls from the sky only to be saved by the strange crystal she wears around her neck. She falls into the arms of Pazu, a young boy who dreams of discovering a hidden flying city in the sky called Laputa, only rumored to exist. Castle in the Sky. It was, I think, on par with Nausicaa. It feels a lot more like a kid's movie than Nausicaa did. I really liked the pirates, the Dyalla gang, being led by Mother. Mother was an excellent character. Best part of this movie was Mom, all of her man children. That was very fun. I don't know, like the robots were sick. The airship design, again, always going to be cool. I feel like I'm probably not going to need to say that every single time. It's about as good as Nausicaa was, and makes a really good companion piece to Nausicaa if it is a little bit more childish than Nausicaa was. My final ranking on Castle in the Sky is 8 out of 10. Movie number 4, Grave of the Fireflies. Here we come to our first Isao Takahata film of the bunch. Grave of the Fireflies is known as being one of the most powerful war movies of all time, with its opening sequence of an American firebombing of a Japanese town being an iconic yet horrifyingly realistic depiction of World War II Japan from the perspective of children. This is the story of a young boy, Seita, and his sister, Setsuko, as they try to survive the last few months of the war. This movie is heartbreakingly bleak, letting you know in the first scene what the outcome of their journey will inevitably be, and that knowledge haunts the viewer through all the highs and lows of the film. Okay, I just saw Grave of the Fireflies by Isao Takahata, and oof, is that the word that I'm looking for? This was a really beautiful movie. I really felt a lot of feelings while I was watching it, which I think is the point. This has been a really big departure from the rest of the movies as of yet. This movie really doesn't pull any punches when it doesn't want to. It's got some pretty gnarly moments here and there that are genuinely shocking. So the beginning of this movie is a mind-blowing sequence of sort of the horrors of this war and what's happening. And then for the rest of the movie, the next 2/3, it really slows down. And I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. I don't think this movie would be quite as watchable if the entire way through was the same as that first sequence. But I don't think there's any point in this movie that hits as hard as the beginning does. I'd probably say it's the best out of everything that I've seen so far. Watch it. My final ranking on Grave of the Fireflies is 8 out of 10. Movie number 5, My Neighbor Totoro. My Neighbor Totoro is one of the most iconic Ghibli movies, and the titular cat-mouse monster thing has been the studio's mascot ever since. Miyazaki drew upon elements of his own childhood for this movie, specifically his mother's own experience with illness and being bedridden while he was growing up. This movie is about 2 young girls, Mei and Satsuki, who moved to a rural town one summer, and one day the younger sister, Mei, discovers a hidden path in the woods. She discovers a massive tree that houses a massive creature, which she befriends and names Totoro. So I just watched My Neighbor Totoro, and oh my gosh, I loved that. This movie has something that's really special about it, and well, like, not a ton happens in this movie. Everything that does just has so much wonder and magic to it that it's really hard not to just adore everything that's happening. I think the only thing that I would complain about in this movie is that there's just not enough Totoro. I want to see more of his world and what he's got going on and what he's up to. I think this movie would have benefited from a bit of a longer runtime because I just want to be wrapped up in that magic a little longer, I think. In my ranking, it's at the moment number 1, and Grave of the Fireflies is number 2. We'll see where we go from here. My final ranking on My Neighbor Totoro is 9 out of 10. Movie number 6, Kiki's Delivery Service. Following hot on Totoro's heels, Kiki's Delivery Service is another slice-of-life tale with fantastical elements. This movie is a much more straightforward coming-of-age tale than Totoro, and many later Ghibli films would borrow heavily from its aesthetic. Kiki is a young witch, and in this world, witches must leave home at the age of 13 in order to complete their training in the real world. She finds herself in a seaside town, and while initially life in the outside world isn't what she expected, she eventually finds her place in the world. Okay, so tonight's movie was Kiki's Delivery Service. This was another one of Miyazaki's films. It was cute, it was fun. I don't really have a lot else to say about it. It's really adorable, and are some moments in the movie that I felt really, really touched me and really gripped me. But there was also a lot of the movie where I just felt, I don't know, a little lost. Like it was having a hard time keeping my attention. I mean, it was good, but it was pretty light on the content, especially since it's about 20 minutes longer than Totoro. I feel like even though not a ton happens in Totoro, not a ton happens here, but it takes longer. My final ranking on Kiki's delivery service is 7 out of 10. Movie number 7, Only Yesterday. If Castle in the Sky was a thesis statement for Miyazaki, Only Yesterday is the same for Takahata. This movie is the slice of life to slice all lives, but is executed with patience and beauty. It might move at a snail's pace, but it uses its runtime wisely to create something really meaningful. This movie is about a woman named Takeo, who finds herself reflecting on her childhood during a summer trip to the countryside. This film cuts between scenes of her elementary school days and her current self, with each memory being provoked by her current circumstances. Tonight I watched Only Yesterday. This is the second Takahata movie on my list. I don't know, I think this movie really hit on something that I really loved, and I'm having a hard time putting my finger on it. Really, it was slow and it was very, very mundane, but in that, it was really lovely. It didn't need to be anything more than that. This movie, once again, touches on the environmentalist themes and talks a lot about agriculture, so much so that I would call this an agricore film. I think it's a little heavy-handed in that at some points. I get it, it feels more like I'm hearing the writer rather than the characters. I don't think this is a movie that everybody would be able to just sit down and enjoy. I think I don't know, maybe I was just in the right headspace for it today, and it just really pulled me into its world. I think if every movie was like this, I feel like I'd have a hard time getting through them all. My final ranking on Only Yesterday is 8 out of 10. Movie number 8, Porco Rosso. Porco Rosso feels like a significant departure from all of Miyazaki's previous and future work, being his most overtly political film that has more than just an environmental message at its heart. This movie feels like a fully realized version of The Castle of Cagliostro, with its inscrutable protagonist and cartoonish execution, despite more adult themes. In pre-World War II Italy, an ace pilot by the name of Porco Rosso spends his days hunting air pirates above the Adriatic Sea. There's only one problem. He's a pig. With the rise of fascism in Italy, Porco finds himself on the run from a government he refuses to serve and vengeful air pirates who want him dead. Hey y'all, I'm gonna keep this one short because I've got a headache. I just watched Porco Rosso, and what the heck? Who gave this movie the right to be that good? Porco Rosso is such an amazing protagonist. I don't know what it is. I think part of it might have just been the voice actor for the dub. This is definitely like probably the best dub I've ever seen for any anime ever. That voice actor, I'll have to look up who it was. They did amazing with Porco. I think that the film does have some moments where it gets kind of corny, and that sort of takes away from it. Some of the problems are solved way too easily, just out of the blue. It's a movie that I feel like I could just watch on any night and love and have a good time. It's just good. And also, it's damn quotable. I'd rather be a pig than a fascist. Top notch. Me too, Porco. My final ranking for Porco Rosso is 9 out of 10. Movie number 9, Ocean Waves. Tomomi Mochizuki was the first director invited to work with Studio Ghibli other than Takahata or Miyazaki. This made-for-TV production was an attempt by the studio to create a movie solely by the younger staff members. But the stress of the production reportedly sent Mochizuki to the hospital. Many have noted that the film is rife with queer subtext, though being totally honest, I did not pick up on it during my watch. Ocean Waves tells the story of Taku, Yutaka, and Rikako, 3 high school students who find themselves in a love triangle. Yutaka has a crush on the new girl Rikako, but due to circumstances playing out the way they do, she ends up spending a lot more time with Taku. The film primarily follows Taku and Rikako's complicated relationship, which makes a lot more sense when you watch the film with the queer subtext in mind and realize that Taku is more interested in Yutaka than he ever was Rikako. Okay, so today's movie was Ocean Waves. I don't know if there's really too much that I can say about this movie. It wasn't boring, but it also wasn't all that interesting. Ultimately, this movie is fine. It's got its moments. It's just not gonna leave you with a lot. This movie's pretty par for the course, and there's not much else to say about it. So, My final ranking on Ocean Waves is 6 out of 10. Movie number 10, Poko. As Porco Rosso was a deviation from Miyazaki's usual fare, Poko is an outlier in Takahata's filmography. This movie is more of an adventure film with many moving parts rather than his usual slice-of-life approach, and incorporates some of the magic Miyazaki normally invokes into my own personal favorite of his canon. As Tokyo is expanding and the surrounding nature is being demolished in order to create new development, a clan of tanuki, being mythological raccoons with the power to shapeshift into anything imaginable, decide to fight back against the humans in order to defend their home.
Okay, tonight's movie was Poko. It's like 3 a.m. right now. I was only able to start this movie at 1 a.m. because it was just a really long day. My head hurts, I'm tired, but I loved that movie. That was amazing. I think it kind of hits like all the marks in like having a really interesting story, really interesting characters, themes. I think some aspects of the movie are a little bit dated and are barriers to its accessibility. For example, I know that they're creatures in Japanese myth and that this is an aspect of the mythological in Japan, but the raccoons' nuts don't need to be out 24/7. That's just not necessary. I think it's a really beautiful film for its environmental messaging and everything like that. Again, unfortunately, I think a lot of people in the West only really adopt those ideas when it's convenient for them or when it makes them look more appealing to the general public. This film is kind of long. You never feel that length. It doesn't feel like it's really long, but it's 2 full hours. That might just be a complaint because I was watching it at 1 in the morning. It's still really worth watching, really good. There's some things that you're gonna have to just get past in order to get everything you can out of this movie, but I think despite its couple of flaws there, it's still a really wonderful movie.
My final ranking on Poko is 9 out of 10. Movie number 11, Whisper of the Heart. Yoshifumi Kondo, the director of this film, was Takahata and Miyazaki's heir apparent for Studio Ghibli. He was a long-time collaborator with the duo, and worked as a key animator on several previous Ghibli films, and was given a crack at directing his own movie with Whisper of the Heart. It's forever going to be a tragedy, however, as Kondo passed away a couple of years after this film's release while working on Ghibli's next project with Miyazaki, with the official cause of death being an aneurysm the doctors attributed to stress from overwork. Whisper of the Heart is the story of Shizuku, a young, aspiring writer struggling her way through middle school while trying to see the magic in the world around her. The movie is very much about how it feels to be a creative person and what can happen when you push yourself too far for the sake of your art. Knowing Kondo's own story, this film is recontextualized in a way that is both beautiful and tragic. Okay, so tonight's movie was Whisper of the Heart, and yeah, that was a good time. I'm definitely feeling fatigued of these slice of life movies that are long. I think that there's a lot that's very, very positive about this movie, and it's, I think, very worth watching. I do think, yeah, it's kind of slow, and I found myself having a difficult time really staying focused while I was watching it. Once you've seen just a bunch of slice of life movies in a row, it just sort of starts to get... There's more to come. We'll see where I'm at by the end of this. My final ranking for Whisper of the Heart is 8 out of 10. Movie 12, Princess Mononoke. I have not seen Princess Mononoke since it traumatized me as a child, but coming back as an adult, this movie blew me out of the water. This movie is the culmination of all of Miyazaki's work that has come before it. Specifically, it feels like a fully realized version of Nausicaa's narrative and themes without any of that movie's shortcoming. This movie is clearly one of Miyazaki's masterpieces, and is largely responsible for Ghibli's success in the West. The production of this film was hellish, being the production that Yoshifumi Kondo passed away while working on. When it was complete, Miyazaki made his first attempt at retiring, quitting the animation industry entirely, which, while short-lived, speaks to the toll that the demands of the anime industry takes on creators. Ashitaka is a young prince whose village is one day attacked by a demon, leading him on a journey westward where he is confronted by a brewing conflict between the technological advancements of humans and the natural world. He meets San, a young girl who has been raised by wolves, as well as Lady Eboshi, a woman who has founded the creation of a new industrial city called Irontown. Ashitaka realizes that no one embroiled in this conflict is fully good or fully evil, and he becomes the conduit between those of the natural world and those of the human world. Tonight's movie was Princess Mononoke. That's, I think, definitely my favorite out of all of these as of yet. I think
that this movie reminded me why I decided to watch every single Studio Ghibli film, why all of these movies are worth watching and important and good. Even if Spirited Away didn't exist, this movie would be more than enough, I think, to put Studio Ghibli on the map. The fact that like it terrified me as a kid adds to that a little bit. Wow, this is something that I remember genuinely finding very scary when I was young, versus now I can appreciate it for everything that it is.
My final ranking for Princess Mononoke is 10 out of 10. Movie 13, My Neighbors the Yamadas. This movie is the polar opposite of Princess Mononoke. I may have said Only Yesterday was the slice of life to slice all lives, but this movie somehow manages to slice even more life. It is a massive departure from Ghibli's usual art style, and ultimately exhibits how the only drum that Takahata would ever beat to would be his own. This movie is an adaptation of the newspaper comic strip Nono-chan, being a light-hearted comedy about a family, the Yamadas, living their daily lives. This movie is a collection of loose, disconnected vignettes of their lives and fantasies.
Okay, so tonight's movie was My Neighbors the Yamadas. This movie is one of Takahata's films. Yeah, I think this one's my least favorite out of everything that I've seen so far. Not because it's offensive or even bad. It's a boring movie. It's cute, and in theory, I like the different animation style that this has to all the rest. It's just very, very mundane and it's kind of lacking substance. If you stumbled across a newspaper and picked it up and saw like a 3-panel strip of something from My Neighbors the Yamadas, then, you know, you might go on with your day after about maybe 15 seconds of looking at it, instead of having nearly 2 hours worth of that. Yeah, it really does capture the experience of watching a newspaper comic for almost 2 hours. I just feel like, you know, this movie is for people that were old 20 years ago. I don't know, maybe I'm just frustrated because I had to sit through like nearly 2 hours of nothing. Alright, I'm gonna stop talking.
My final ranking for My Neighbors the Yamadas is 5 out of 10. Movie 14, Spirited Away. More than any other Studio Ghibli production, this film is a household name in the West. If you haven't watched any other anime or kept up with animation at all, you've at least heard of Spirited Away. And for good reason. This movie has more than earned its reputation as a classic, being the only non-American film as of yet to win Best Animated Picture at the Oscars. Chihiro is a 10-year-old girl whose family gets a little lost while driving to their new home after moving. They stumble upon an old, abandoned amusement park, and Chihiro wanders off when her parents start eating the food that has mysteriously appeared in one of the stalls. When night falls, the park lights up, and the park's true guests arrive, spirits of all shapes and sizes. Chihiro is isekai'd away from the human world, and is only able to survive with the spirits by seeking employment at the park's main attraction, the Witch Yubaba's bathhouse.
Alright folks, we did it. We got there. It's the big one. Just watched Spirited Away, and like, I don't know, what do you expect me to say? This movie's a masterpiece. Every little bit of this film is memorable and amazing and beautiful. Like, I can just heap praise on this movie endlessly, as people have done for the past 20 years. But I think this movie really does deserve it. I think Princess Mononoke was a bit more of a coherent narrative. This movie, a lot of the time, it just feels like, oh my gosh, things are happening. So many things all the time. Whereas I think Princess Mononoke had a bit of a better flow to it. But at the same time, like, I'm saying that and I'm thinking like, you know, this movie does flow really well. I think it just flows in a bit more of an abstract manner. And I don't know if I can really give it more or less points for that. Yeah, Spirited Away. It's a masterpiece, 10 out of 10. That's the take. This hot take that everybody comes to this video for. Everybody wants to hear me just say Spirited Away is good. I did it. You're welcome.
My final ranking for Spirited Away is 10 out of 10. Movie 15, The Cat Returns. The Cat Returns is a bit of an oddball within Ghibli's catalog. Initially, this spin-off, sequel, reimagining, loose interpretation of Whisper of the Heart was going to be a short film for an amusement park, but when those plans fell through, the studio gave the project to Hiroyuki Morita to turn into a full-length movie. This movie feels stylistically different from the rest of Ghibli's features as well, specifically in its character design and story. and its dub is likely one of the best out of the bunch, save for Porco Rosso. The Cat Returns was initially intended to be the adaptation of the novel that Shizuku was writing during Whisper of the Heart. It is the story of Haru, a clumsy high school girl who, after unwittingly saving the Prince of the Cat Kingdom, becomes the obsession of local felines. She seeks the assistance of Baron Humbert von Gickingen, the figurine from the antique shop in Whisper of the Heart of an aristocratic cat, and adventure ensues.
Okay, so today's movie was The Cat Returns. I really liked this movie. I really liked its characters, its story. It was a lot of fun. It really just left me wanting more. There's a bit of a line between wanting more in a way where it's like, oh, wow, this is great and I wish there was more of it. This movie wasn't long enough to be as satisfying as it possibly could have been. I think it just ended up being a little too quickly paced. The other thing that I think bothers me about this movie, or is just kind of annoying about it, is that one of the cats, Muta, is basically the stereotypical fat person and unfortunately falls into a lot of the tropes that are in like every movie that includes a character that is fat. Oh, he likes eating, everybody's making jokes at this guy's expense all the time, and it's just like, that's every single movie and isn't necessary. It's unfortunate. Even so, I think I liked it a lot more than some of the other films that I've watched. Overall, I still really liked it. I still really thought it was fun. I think this movie would have worked really well as like an animated series. But I don't think that'll happen because that's not really what Ghibli has done with any of their movies or films. And, you know, it's okay to let things go.
My final ranking on The Cat Returns is 8 out of 10. Movie number 16, Howl's Moving Castle. This movie is Miyazaki's third masterpiece. It's likely his most well-known movie following Spirited Away, and is an adaptation of Diane Wynne Jones' novel of the same name. Like all Ghibli adaptations, much was significantly altered from the source material. Miyazaki's disapproval of America's invasion of Iraq influenced the anti-war sentiments present in the film that were not a part of Jones's book. Set in a unique fantasy kingdom, Sophie is a young woman who lives quietly in a haberdashery until one day she meets a mysterious rogue wizard, Howl. Because of her brief interaction with Howl, she is targeted by the Witch of the Wastes, a mage whose unrequited obsession has led her to become possessive of Howl. Her spell ages Sophie into her 90s, and Sophie sets out to find some way to break the curse.
Okay, so tonight's movie was Howl's Moving Castle. I adore this movie. This movie is very, very good, and I like watching it a lot. It's a long movie, but it doesn't feel long whatsoever. I think the progression of the plot and everything that keeps happening really works well. I've heard some people describe this movie as being a bit scattered in its plot, and that it's kind of all over the place. I fully disagree with that. I think this movie felt very coherent and very, very well paced. Maybe that's just me and I have no idea what I'm talking about. I think this movie really affects me and speaks to me more than I think Princess Mononoke and Spirited Away did. Like, I don't know if I could say that I liked it more than either of those movies, but I think it just made me feel something more than either of those movies did. It's not meant to really knock either of them. Man, I almost want to watch those 3 movies over again, but I've got 10 movies to go or something. I don't know.
My final ranking on Howl's Moving Castle is 10 out of 10. Movie 17, Tales from Earthsea. Tales from Earthsea. This movie has a particularly interesting production history. So, Miyazaki wanted to adapt Ursula K. Le Guin's Earthsea books for a long time, and she, not knowing his work, refused. But after Spirited Away made waves in America, she decided to give the okay, so long as Miyazaki himself made the movie. But at the time, Miyazaki was in the midst of working on Howl, so Ghibli's producer, Toshio Suzuki, offered the position of director to Miyazaki's son, Goro. Goro had no background in animation. In fact, he'd gone to school for agriculture and was involved in the architecture and curation of Studio Ghibli's museum. Miyazaki Sr. was furious when he heard that his son accepted the job after Suzuki pressured him into it. Miyazaki himself had to work his way up the ranks for decades in order to become a director, and here, his son was being offered the job without any experience at all. Miyazaki Sr. hardly spoke a word to his son during the film's production, and Goro was left with little guidance on how to create a film. Miyazaki Sr. famously left the theater during its premiere to have a cigarette, and was quoted to say, "It's good that he made one movie. With that, he should stop." However, he later reconnected with his son and relented in his harsh criticism, saying, "It was made honestly, so it was good." Tales from Earthsea recounts the story of a young prince, Aaron, who is on the run after killing his father, the king. While staggering through the desert, he comes across a wandering mage, Sparrowhawk, who becomes his guide as the two adventure together.
Today's movie was Tales from Earthsea. Yeah, I understand why this movie has the reputation that it does. It certainly doesn't measure up to what's come before it. I feel kind of bad ripping into this movie because I feel like people have likely done that enough, but I'm still going to give my thoughts and opinions about it. I think that ultimately the biggest problems with this movie lie with its script rather than its direction. I think that the script is poorly paced and misunderstands pretty much everything that has come before it in the studio's filmography. You just don't care about what's going on. Yeah, I feel like, again, this movie isn't awful. It's not the worst thing ever, but it's disappointing. Oh well.
My final ranking of Tales from Earthsea is 4 out of 10. Movie number 18, Ponyo. Ponyo feels very much like Miyazaki's apology to Goro for how he treated his son during the production of Tales from Earthsea. The themes of fatherhood in this movie reflect Miyazaki's own absence from his son's life, and Goro has said in the past that he was raised by his father's movies more so than his actual father. More so, this movie depicts a father trying to control his child, when ultimately that child is their own person and will live their own life. Miyazaki came out of retirement once again to make this movie, and while it may not reach the heights of his previous 3 films, it's still a great watch. This movie is about a little boy, Sosuke, no, not that Sasuke, get out of here, who one day finds a little fish with a human face, which he names Ponyo. However, Ponyo's father, Fujimoto, upon recapturing his daughter, finds that she has fallen in love with the boy and wants to become a human too, despite the consequences.
Tonight's movie was Ponyo. This was a fun time. This movie was pretty much the definition of adorable. I really liked it. I think that it suffers from some of the same problems that some of Miyazaki's earlier films did. Once again, we're back to the days of characters narrating what they're doing for no reason. Once again, like Miyazaki's character designs are just on point. I especially like Ponyo's father. I just really enjoyed that character design. There were some really jaw-dropping segments in this movie that blew my mind a little bit. The scene particularly where Ponyo was running on top of the waves, I was floored and I wasn't even standing up. So I think there was a lot about this movie that was really worth loving, but I do think it was a lot lighter than the last few Miyazaki movies. Obviously, this movie is more of a kid's movie than pretty much any of his movies other than Totoro. Although I think Totoro, even despite that, holds your hand a little less than this movie does, and I don't think this movie needed to hold your hand quite as much as it did. Still a good movie that is definitely a fun time and is a good way to spend a night.
My final ranking of Ponyo is 8 out of 10. Movie 19, The Secret World of Arietti. Hiromasa Yonebayashi worked his way up at Studio Ghibli from an in-betweener on Princess Mononoke up to a key animator on Spirited Away, and was likely the studio's new ideal successor for the aging Miyazaki and Takahata. He was the youngest director in the studio's history. For his directorial debut, he adapted a classic British novel, The Borrowers by Mary Norton, which is another project that both Takahata and Miyazaki had been eyeballing for quite some time. Arietti is 4 inches tall, as she is a borrower, a race of tiny people who survive by borrowing small items from humans that they won't miss. She lives with her mom and dad underneath the secluded home of 2 elderly ladies. However, when Arietti is spotted by a sickly young boy, Sho, her life is thrown into chaos.
Tonight's movie was The Secret World of Arietti. Yeah, this was a good time. I don't think it really, grabbed me. It was still, I think, a worthwhile film. This movie is about Arietti, who is a species, I guess, called the borrowers, who are, essentially house hippos. They sneak around your house at night and get into your snacks. It felt very small scale. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. We really only saw a microcosm of this fantasy world once again, where there might have been more out there that would have been cool to see. It feels very Disney. Not a bad thing. Many Disney movies are good, but I'm definitely getting more and more of that vibe, especially with Ponyo and this movie. I don't know if that'll keep going moving forward. Still worth noting, I think.
My final ranking of The Secret World of Arietti is 8 out of 10. Movie number 20, From Up on Poppy Hill. Miyazaki's senior and junior had reconnected over the birth of Goro's son, and Goro had become much more adept and experienced in the craft of animation. He'd learned a lot through Tales from Earthsea, but to ensure his next film's success, Toshio Suzuki paired him up with his father. With Hayao writing the screenplay and Goro directing, this film would have a lot more guidance than his previous efforts on his own. From Up on Poppy Hill is about a young girl, Umi, growing up in a rural port town in the 1960s. She lives in her grandmother's boarding home and does most of the cooking and housework there. The boys at her high school are currently protesting the imminent demolition of their club building, the Latin Quarter, and after meeting a young boy there who works on their self-published newspaper, she becomes invested in the preservation of the building as well. Today's movie was From Up on Poppy Hill. I think this movie does a lot of things very well. Nothing in it really blew me away, I would say. Nothing really drove me crazy in a good way or a bad way. But I think it was just still a really strong story, a really fun story, and overall pretty well done. The music was great. The music is always great in every single one of these movies. But I think the blend between a bit more of a traditional sound to jazz sequences for the more intense moments stood out to me as something that I really liked. I don't think I was ever bored during the movie. Today I wasn't feeling all that great all day, and I think this movie, after watching it, sort of helped me feel a little better throughout the day, so I think I really appreciate this movie for doing that. My final ranking of From Up on Poppy Hill is 7 out of 10. Movie 21, The Wind Rises. The Wind Rises was to be Miyazaki's final film, for real this time. Hayao had created a short manga based off of Tatsuo Hori's novel about the life of Jiro Horikoshi, The Wind Has Risen, and Toshio Suzuki recommended that he turn it into a film. Initially, Miyazaki was resistant to the idea, but upon hearing a quote from Horikoshi saying, "All I wanted to do was to create something beautiful," he decided to make the film. This movie is a fictionalized biopic of the life of Jiro Horikoshi. The real-life Horikoshi was an aircraft designer who created the Mitsubishi A6M0, which was one of the most devastating fighter planes used by the Japanese in World War II. The Wind Rises imagines Horikoshi's life and desires, and his struggle between his love of the craft of aviation and the demands of his country to turn his creations into weapons.
I just watched The Wind Rises. I have some complicated feelings, I think, towards this movie. I think this is Miyazaki's most mature movie, and I think it is quite nuanced and very, very masterfully executed. Again, there are some mind-blowing sequences in this movie, some real feats of animation and storytelling in general. However, around, I think, I'd say the midpoint of this movie, things just slow way down. It got hard to stay invested in what was happening, and I don't know if there's any point in the movie where it picked back up again. I think this movie was at its best when it was sort of showing you the planes and showing you the advancements, but then all of a sudden we're taken out of that world for the sort of romance plot, which is, not necessarily a bad thing. It just felt like a tonal shift from the rest of the movie where things were just not moving. Some of the most interesting parts of this movie were when it sort of had this undercurrent of intrigue hinted towards some of the political landscape of Japan in that era and of Germany in that era, but it didn't do anything with those threads. I realize when you're making a biopic, you're sort of constrained. You have to be as accurate as you can be with somebody's life story, and I'm sure there were a lot of creative liberties taken in this movie, but at the same time, I think some of the things that happened just didn't end up maybe being the most interesting parts of his life and the parts that were focused on. While I think they were impactful, I don't think that this is maybe the most effective way that this story could have been fully explored.
My final ranking on The Wind Rises is 7 out of 10. Movie 22, The Tale of Princess Kaguya. It took Takahata 9 years to complete his final film. He decided to adapt an old Japanese fairy tale, The Tale of the Bamboo Cutter. The animation style of this film most closely resembles that of My Neighbors the Yamadas, but is ultimately fundamentally different than anything Ghibli had produced to date. Takahata's heart and soul are in this movie, and it is beautiful. Takahata passed away in 2018 at the age of 82. The Tale of Princess Kaguya begins with an old bamboo cutter out in the woods, who stumbles upon one stalk containing a tiny girl in regal clothing. When he brings this girl back to show his wife, the small person becomes a human baby, who the elderly couple decide to raise as their own. She grows much faster than a normal child, and upon discovering the gifts of gold and fine clothing in the woods, the old bamboo cutter decides that these gifts are signs that the girl must be treated as royalty, and decides that the three of them must leave their rural mountain life behind and live as nobles, even if it isn't what his adopted daughter wants.
Tonight's movie was The Tale of Princess Kaguya. That was a really beautiful movie and a really beautiful experience. I enjoyed it a lot. I think it was quite gorgeous. Anybody who's seen any clip of the animation or any still frame will know that this is just one of the best looking works of animation maybe ever. I do think that this movie once again does drag quite a bit, but I do think that there's no moment when you can look at the screen at this movie and not be marveling at what you are seeing, what your eyes are taking in, all of the watercolor backgrounds with the rough, sketchy animation. And one of the, I think, really interesting aspects of this movie is its take on class and happiness. There's this running theme throughout the movie that where many characters associate class and status and wealth with happiness. That really does expose, I think, what this movie is at its core about. It's about happiness. It's about life. It's about class. Nobody else can tell you what will make you happy. And the things that society tells you will make you happy aren't going to do that. Happiness is not an emotion that is divisible by class. And I think that's really cool.
My final ranking of The Tale of Princess Kaguya is 9 out of 10. Movie 23, When Marnie Was There. Another adaptation of a British novel, When Marnie Was There is Yonebayashi's second film with Studio Ghibli. Once again, this project was another that Miyazaki had once been interested, but never made himself. Ana Sasaki is a young girl who struggles with anxiety, depression, and asthma. Her foster mother, who is quite worried about Anna, decides that she should spend the summer somewhere with cleaner air. And so she contacts some relatives in a rural town for Anna to stay with. Anna, while having a difficult time connecting with the other kids in town, becomes interested in an old abandoned house on the marsh, where she meets its otherworldly resident, a young girl by the name of Marnie.
Tonight's movie was When Marnie Was Here. I don't know. This movie didn't really do it for me, unfortunately. I guess my biggest frustration with this movie is that it feels very much like queer baiting. For those of you who may not know, that's when you make it seem like there is a queer relationship in this movie or like queer theming, and then fully just go back on it. There's a twist sort of at the end that completely cuts that possibility out of the story. You can't do this and not know that's how it comes across. The relationship that is built between the two characters is very, very queer-coded. I don't know what to tell you. It just is. And then to be completely denied by the end of the movie that that's what was going on, it feels very underwhelming, I guess, to me. And that aside, the story of the movie is actually is a very beautiful story and a very emotional story. I just feel like it could have been presented in a way that wasn't queer baiting. And so that to me is a frustration. The other thing is, I think that this is as far as like a depiction of anxiety and depression and those things, I think this movie did that very well and handled that very well, addressed the things that were very human about it, I think in a way that made it kind of hard to watch. And I think it's very human, but it makes it very hard to connect with Anna. I think, wow, she's hurting people around her very much.
My final ranking of When Marnie Was There is 4 out of 10. Movie 24, The Red Turtle. Studio Ghibli, following the retirements of Miyazaki Sr., Takahata, and Toshio Suzuki, was now in a difficult place. While all three were still working at the studio to a lesser extent than before, there was still a void that left many unsure of the studio's direction. Goro Miyazaki was working on the studio's first and only anime series, the CGI Rania and the Robber's Daughter, and the overseas production of a collaboration with Dutch animator Michael de Dock de Wit was underway. But without Miyazaki Sr. and Takahata, it was decided that the studio would go into an indefinite hiatus. At this time, Yonebayashi and Ghibli's new producer, Yoshiaki Nishimura, had jumped ship entirely and founded Studio Ponnock. The Red Turtle was released in the middle of this hiatus. This movie had taken nearly as long as previous Kaguya to complete, being the only movie with Studio Ghibli's name on it that had not been produced in-house. Takahata oversaw much of the production personally, and had quite a bit of input into this film, but ultimately, it is de Dock de Wit's original vision. The story of the Red Turtle is told without words, and is the tale of a man who is stranded on a desert isle. Every time he attempts to build a raft and leave the island, he is prevented from doing so by a large red sea turtle, who repeatedly destroys his rafts and sends him back to the island.
Tonight's movie was The Red Turtle. This movie is really amazing, and I really, really, really loved it. And this movie is about a man who's in a real 3-hour tour situation. I think that this movie is really a masterpiece. Like, I can't think of anything that I really want to complain about. Yeah, this film really has a lot to say about mankind's relationship with nature and on loneliness and companionship, what it means to have a family. It's not long, it's pretty short, but it uses all of that time so well, and it doesn't hold your hand at all, and it doesn't need to. I think this movie does so many things so well, and I think it deserves more recognition.
My final ranking of The Red Turtle is 10 out of 10. Movie 25, Earwig and the Witch. Shortly after the release of The Red Turtle, it was announced that Miyazaki Sr. was coming out of retirement to work on one last film, which breathed some life into the studio that many had assumed dead. With this, it was soon announced that Goro would be working on his own new film as well, which would be Ghibli's first fully CGI animated feature film. After getting a feel for CGI working on Rania, Goro decided that he would pursue CGI as a medium in order to set himself apart from his father's work and become his own artist. The result of this is Earwig and the Witch, Ghibli's second adaptation of a Diane Wynne Jones novel. Goro wanted this film to look similar to the style of stop-motion movies like the ones Laika was making in America. However, the film's change in animation style didn't garner the greatest reception among fans of the studio. Earwig is a little girl who grew up in an orphanage and was cunning enough to manipulate everyone there into doing what she wanted. However, when she is adopted by the witch Bella Yaga and her strange companion, the Mandrake, she no longer has the same control over her life, and decides that she'll cause whatever mischief she must in order to make her new parents answer her every whim.
Okay, so I watched Earwig and the Witch tonight, and I see that this movie had a lot of potential that it didn't quite live up to. I think the sort of popular opinion of a lot of people was that, oh, this movie is CGI, it's bad. I actually liked the animation. That wasn't where I take issue with this movie. I think this movie has a lot more problems just in its story and structure more so than its aesthetics. This movie hints at a larger world and a more complex setting and some interesting lore, and then does nothing with it. At the beginning of the movie, there's something mentioned about like a council of 12 witches or something, and you think that might be important, but then it just never comes up again. Same with Earwig's mother. You think that, I don't know, there might be something there, and it's just not brought up again. I really did like the character of the Mandrake, because it seemed like he had more going on and more sort of under the surface that would have been really interesting to explore. And the whole history with the band, I actually understand that that was something that Goro added to the movie. The music aspect wasn't really a part of the original story, and I wish that there was more, because I found those were the most interesting parts of the movie, where I was the most engaged, whereas all of the time where Earwig is just kind of messing around in only 2 rooms of this house that most of the movie is set in. I don't think it's bad. I think it's disappointing, but not bad, and I think there's room to grow, so.
My final ranking of Earwig and the Witch is 4 out of 10. And that's it, folks. That's the entirety of the magic and adventure of Studio Ghibli. Now, you may have an idea of my favorites and least favorites based on the numbers that I've given each film, but here's my final list, ranked from my favorite to my least favorite. It was difficult to rank a lot of these movies. Even looking at it right now, there are some that I feel like I've ranked too highly or ranked too low. But for now, I'll stick with it. Most movies here landed in the 8 out of 10 range, which really isn't a surprise to me. Most of Studio Ghibli's movies are that good. Even the ones that aren't the best are still pretty dang watchable. Maybe some of the aspects of my list are a little basic, sure, but maybe there's some entries that you found surprising in what I liked and didn't like. Once again, all of my opinions are objective. I do not see how anyone could disagree with them because they're the truth. That's just the way it is. Please comment down below how all of your opinions are exactly the same as mine. There's still a lot of uncertainty regarding Ghibli's future. It seems to me that Goro will still be making 3D CGI animation with the company for the foreseeable future, despite the backlash that has been received for Earwig. Miyazaki came out of retirement in early 2017 to work on what will be his final film, most likely for real this time, which will be an adaptation of a 1937 novel by Yoshino Genzaburo, hopefully I pronounced that right, called How Do You Live? The film is slated for release in 2023, however, I don't necessarily trust that, and I'm pretty sure we'll have another Red Turtle or Princess Kaguya situation on our hands. Miyazaki is aging, but he is still every bit the perfectionist he ever was, but he can no longer work at the same pace he did when he was younger. Regardless, once Miyazaki's final film is complete, it is still uncertain what will happen with Studio Ghibli afterwards. They already closed their doors once when Miyazaki left before, even though they still had Yonebayashi and Goro Miyazaki working for them. I can't say for certain, but I think even if the studio only puts out one more film, they're still leaving behind an exceptional body of work that few others can boast of. Hey y'all, so at the end of my last video, I said that I would have this video out by early March. Yeah, so that was a lie. Yeah, this video took me several months to complete. I went through like, I don't know, a handful of different video editing programs and trying to learn my way around those before giving up on them and finding a new one. And ultimately this whole project just ended up being a lot bigger than I expected it to be. I had to scale it back quite a bit from what I initially envisioned for it, because it ended up being an hour even with what it is. I'm still pretty, I'd say, satisfied with how it turned out. Like, I mean, there's things that I learned a lot while I was doing it. I was also hoping to use actual like footage from the movies instead of just having stills. Ghibli actually cracks down really hard on copyright for channels that try to use their footage on YouTube for literally anything regardless of fair use. So I just did stills instead, and I was gonna go through a whole process of like keyframing them and like having movement, but I'm tired and I've been working on this for months, so I'm just gonna leave it there. Yeah, I'm gonna try and actually have a more consistent upload schedule if I can. I want to try and aim for every 2 weeks. If that ends up being not doable, I'm not going to commit to it right now, but that's what I'd like to aim for, and have smaller videos than this, much much smaller. But I will be uploading the video that is all of the reviews that I really condensed for this video. I'll be just those full gut reaction reviews. So that video will be up next Saturday. Unless you're watching this in the future, then it's already up and will be on the screen in a moment. If you haven't yet, check out the other video that I did I posted at the beginning of February. Like, comment, subscribe if you haven't, please do. I want to build this channel, make it into something if that's possible. Yeah, it's really late. I'm tired. I want to go to bed. So it's time to turn out the lights.